Good afternoon and welcome back to the conference. This is day 4 of the conference, and I hope that you've been having a thought-provoking one that has suitably dismantled and disrupted normative ways of thinking, theorizing, and researching. As I speak fast, I just want to remind everyone here that if you're speaking, please keep in mind that everything we're saying is also being signed by the interpreters. So you might want to pace yourself in a way that they would be able to, present what you're saying appropriately. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome and introduce Professor Fiona Kumari Campbell as the speaker of today's plenary session. Professor Fiona Kumari Campbell is Professor of Disability and Ableism Studies, School of Education and Social Work, University of Dundee. She was Deputy Head of School Learning and Teaching Scholarship at the Griffith Law School until July 2014. Previous to this, she was convener of the largest disability studies program in the Southern Hemisphere, School of Human Services and Social Work at Griffith University. That's from 2001 to 2010. Fiona is an adjunct professor in disability studies at the Faculty of Medicine, University of Kelaniya, Sri Lanka. As a disabled biracial person, she is familiar both personally and research-based with the experiences of living peripherally. Fiona is recognized as a world leader in scholarship around studies in ableism, the idea of human difference and devaluation that explains studies in ableism, and has written extensively on issues related to global South theory, disability and jurisprudence, disability in Sri Lanka, and dis/technology. She regularly gives keynotes at international events. After the successful publication of her groundbreaking book, which is Contours of Ableism, The Production of Disability and Abledness by Paul Grave, she is working on 2 book manuscripts. One is #Ableism, an interdisciplinary introduction to studies in ableism, and the other is Textures of Ableism, Disability, Voice, and Marginality. Her paper today is titled Able-Bodiedness as the Enemy, a reflective exposition of this claim, drawing on studies in ableism. I think that this title syncs very well with the theme of the conference, which is primarily resistance, because Professor Campbell's work over the last decade and more has resisted certain assumptions about ableism and able-bodiedness. Her work continues to explicate how reductive it is to use ableism as a way of calling out actions and behavior that we believe to be preordained as insensitive to disabled people or as privileging able-bodied people. Professor Campbell's scholarship urges that we clarify that able-bodiedness and ableism are not predetermined, and that we undertake the hard work to explicate them in all their complexity. So thereby she calls for a thorough and rigorous understanding of ableism. Professor Campbell, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to speak at this annual international conference. I invite you now to give your lecture.
Thank you very much, Shilpaa, and good afternoon, everybody. It's such a thrill to present at this conference, and I must say over the years I've really enjoyed engaging in discussions with my Indian comrades and the amazing work that's coming out of India. I almost sit there and envy, given some of the challenges of producing disability studies within the Sri Lankan context. Now I'm going to share my slides. Let's hope this, here we go. Can you see that? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay. Now I thought I'd better put up some slides. In fact, actually what I've been doing recently is just reading out and speaking to a written paper but I've just decided today, because I thought people might be slightly unfamiliar with some of the concepts, to have a couple of slides. The good news is, if you don't understand what I'm saying, or I'm saying things too quickly, I will circulate to Shilpaa to pass on to you a draft written copy of the paper. So you've got the paper as your insurance policy, and the slides, as I said, are just supplementary. So so with that, we'll move on. So this is part of my work. I've been working on studies in ableism since 2001. I'm feeling a little bit old in some ways, and as my thinking has developed over time, also what is happening is that I am also looking at how the idea of ableism is taken up within the disability studies community, and more broadly in communities that are looking at social justice issues in the university, but also within social justice movements, so grassroots activism. So I will put a link in the paper. It's actually on the first page, because and it will be a link to my Academia EDU site. And I have a series of 4 papers that I've given over the COVID lockdown. I've actually been in lockdown since March. I haven't left the house. March last year, by the way. I haven't left the house. And you'll be able to follow the progress of the ideas, because I can't necessarily come up with cover everything today. So the background to this paper for you today, this is the first time I've spoken about this particular issue, the idea of able-bodiedness as the enemy. My thoughts are somewhat provisional. Now, why now? So there's 2 challenges currently in the disability studies and studies in ableism field. And I'll explain the differences between those 2 fields in a minute. So the first challenge, which Shilpaa alluded to, is the need for rigor and precision. Now, this should be, by the way, in all research. And one of the, I guess, deficits or emerging trends in particularly the last 10 to 15 years, where ableism as a phrase, as a concept, has taken off, is that whilst we are seeing the proliferation and of usage of ableism, particularly in social media, one of my critiques or one of my concerns relates to the fact that people, when they're writing about ableism or speaking about ableism, they don't actually tell us what they mean by that word. And that can be quite dangerous. Okay, so one of the things that I argue is, on one hand, I should be happy. I mean, when I first started out in 2001, ableism was pretty much not used. You know, it was rare. And, you know, I should be happy sitting back, you know, in the last 10 years to find that ableism keeps coming up everywhere in all sorts of really interesting places. And I am happy, but the difficulty, as I said, the challenge is that probably 95% of the cases or instances, very few people define what they mean by ableism. And definitions are really important. We need to, this comes back to the precision and rigor issue. So the audience, whether it be a reader or somebody, you know, face to face, needs some clarification about how you are using a concept. What does that concept denote? What does it not cover, for example? And if that's not done, what we're faced with is we've got a word that's being used and maybe even overused, some people would argue. It runs the risk of being emptied of meaning. Okay, so it just becomes another ism. So it loses its power as an analytical concept, as a theoretical concept. So that's one thing that I've been addressing in my previous papers. And the second area, and which will be the focus once I outline ableism and some of the issues. The second focus then is looking at this, again, a trend. It's a trend certainly in the West of using ableism almost as a sledgehammer. I don't know if that analogy works, but kind of as a battering ram, as an insult almost, to accuse somebody of being ableist, that often involves then the association with being able-bodied as oppositional to disabled people's rights. So I'll talk about that. It's apart from it being a bit nasty and conflict-based, it actually misses what ableism and studies in ableism speak to. Okay, so you're just going to have this this cover thing for the moment. So Western social theory predominantly has emanated from the United States. Yes, there's European approaches, but I'm particularly looking at Western social theory and the development of social justice movements. And these kinds of theories have tended to focus on the notion of difference, which feeds into then a kind of minority and more recently identity group basis for political campaigning. So again, just to put that more plainly, so this idea we've moved from similarity and solidarity to an emphasis on differences between people, which is somewhat ironic in some ways, because often social movements are actually trying to challenge notions of difference, particularly if those notions of difference result in inequalities and hostilities, and indeed genocide in some cases. But these movements, in responding to that, in fact, in many ways have re-embraced this notion of difference. And sometimes this idea of difference there are different scales of it, but some groups will argue that this difference is almost essentialist, almost naturalized. And you'll see this, for example, in the tension around race discourse. You'll, on one hand, have groups wanting to challenge racial categorization. We've talked about in the last 20 to 30 years, probably even longer, the idea of race as a fiction, as something that doesn't exist biologically. And yet at the same time, what often happens is that writings and social movements also draw on the idea of racial difference. And you see this come out time and time again, that, you know, we'll often say that, you know, particular cultures or particular groups have core attributes that make them different from other people. So there's a kind of like a contradiction built into that. However, you know, and I should say that a lot of this is also related to the fact, particularly with the influence from the United States, and we haven't got enough time to go into this today, but you might be thinking, well, why is there this kind of fixation with dividing people into groups, minority groups and categories? And a lot of that is to do with US constitutional law that really only grants people access to remedies and, you know, remedies for discrimination on the basis of being a member of a minority group. So you have, so the whole thing, the whole logic around US law and US thinking is clustered around this idea of particular categories. Now you might be wondering, well, what's that? How is that relevant to us? We're not in the United States. You're in India, I'm in Scotland. The fact is, you know, and again, for those of you who have looked at colonialism and neo-colonialism, is that the United States plays a significant role exporting its ideas to the world, and they're picked up, and often they're picked up uncritically. Okay, so even in terms of United States and UK, for example, things are different in the UK from the United States. The basis of community, how groups are associated with each other, and the same with in India. But sometimes we embrace concepts and theories that are particularly emanated from the United States uncritically, and that's the issue. It's the uncritically. Instead of stopping and saying, well, how does this speak to our lived realities, our systems of governance, our ways of viewing the human being and the concept of self? I'll come back to that later. And I'll say in my other papers, I talk about this a lot, about the need to have more research around concepts of community, concepts of self, to show some of the differences in thinking, bringing in Indian philosophy, etc. Anyway, I'm digressing a little bit there. So there's a fantastic book, if you haven't come across it. It's called Similarity. It's edited by Anand Bhatti and Dorothy Campbell. So we've got an Indian scholar and a German scholar, and that came out in 2018. They've argued that this orientation on difference has unduly concentrated on and indeed magnified the difference of differences. So in other words, if we're focusing on difference all the time, whilst that might be constructive, it has, I guess, the effect of emphasizing the differences between groups, the differences between human beings. Both of them have argued that instead of fostering social harmony, difference then has promoted division. Okay, and we're seeing, as I said, we're seeing this play out with some of the kind of debates globally around the relationship between minoritized groups and mainstream society. It's often led, and I mentioned this earlier, it's often led to an essentialism of the categories of humanness, right? So what do I mean by that? It's kind of like this naturalization of those differences. They also, but their book is just a critique. Bhatti and Campbell argue that there is an alternative theorization, and that is to explore notions of similarity and contrast. And I open with these thoughts to argue at the outset that studies in ableism, with its preoccupation on systems of ableness, can explore the similarities and threads between the life worlds of subordinated peoples, divided by categories of race, sex, class, caste, normalcy, without conflating and reducing differences, and indeed examine the interplay between categorization, identity, and agency. Now, what am I saying here in kind of plain talk? So one of the things about studies in ableism, because, and I will explain what it's on about in a minute, but because studies in ableism puts the spotlight back on the idea of abledness, right? What does abledness mean? What does ability mean? Because of its focus on that, it actually has the capacity, and well, it's already doing it, to focus beyond disabled people, not replacing disabled people. Let's get this clear. And instead of some of these ideas have been sharpened up at a previous conference I spoke at in India. It's not to replace disability, but in fact, studies in ableism, because it looks at this idea of ableness, can actually look at other forms of hierarchy and dehumanization. So actually, that's of a benefit. Furthermore, we can then have the opportunity to look at where there are points of convergence, where there are points of similarity, right? And where there are points of difference. So studies in ableism really helps us think through in a more flexible and fluid way, the nature of dehumanization, nature of categorization, and I think that's good. I think at a practical level also it allows social movements to come together in coalition and to be allies with each other's situation, as against, as I said to you, this focus on difference, which is quite divisive. Okay, so I think that's particularly important when it comes to disabled people, because whilst disabled people are high in number, we very much are the afterthought, the group that's left off policy agendas. I don't know what it's like in India, but in the UK, it's even with the so-called progressive left, disability is often left off the list of subordinated identities. So it allows for then, I think, a really exciting possibility of engaging in conversations, as I said, to look at where are the similarities of devaluation or dehumanization, where do they come together, and what are the different textures? So, for example, what are the different textures of racism and ableism, for example, or casteism? Anyway, I'll get onto that later. So, okay, so but what is ableism? I'm just going to put the next slide. I think that's the slide. Why isn't it moving? Okay, I'm just going to put this up here and I'll talk about that definition. As I said, that definition is 2001 and it's particularly academic. So I'm going to talk about that just to unpack it, right? First thing to say, if someone was to ask you in the street, what is studies in ableism and what's ableism about? What's really studies in ableism? So studies in ableism is a family of ideas about humanization and dehumanization. Now, I've put family of ideas because my approach to studying ableism is that it's my approach. There are some other approaches, not many, because it's actually, that's an issue also I'll raise later, that there's been in the last 20 or so years, or at least since 2001, which is longer, there's actually been still limited theorizing here. But it's a family of ideas and some things come together. And the exciting thing about when you're working with a new theoretical approach is that we can test out and tease out and explore how the theory might apply to a particular group, right? So my work, for example, I've been quite surprised where it's been picked up beyond disability. It's been picked up by people working around immigration, refugees, ethnic cleansing, and computer science. I'm not quite sure how that fits in, but it has been picked up in computer science, obviously bioethics and those sort of areas. And recently I was approached, you won't find this on the paper because I'm just now speaking to this, but recently I was approached to work on a grant with with international scholars, looking at the moon. You've got it right. The moon as a ecological resource, and they wanted to bring in somebody, so it's multidisciplinary, to speak about ableism. So studies in ableism, then, we can really say has no limits. But the important bit is it really brings together a family of ideas around humanization. So what does it mean to be human? And it also looks at the processes and practices of dehumanization, right? Of what I call later the creation of disposable people, right? The creation of disposable people. Ablement, now that might not be a familiar word. Ablement is the process of becoming abled. Now, I don't make up words just for the sake of it. And, you sometimes hear that academics come up with ridiculous kind of phraseology. And I wanted to avoid creating new words. It is a new word, ablement, but I wanted to have a more active kind of concept of what is the process that we engage in each day in becoming abled, right? So it's an active term, this idea of the processes of becoming abled according to a particular ideal. Okay, and again, we'll come back to that later. It might be, for example, the process of becoming abled in relationship to being seen as a productive worker in the workplace, right? So this notion of ablement, then it does impact on our daily routines, everything we do, interactions, speculations, and significantly our imagination about what is the good life. So it's aspirational as well, this idea of what does it mean to be human, and what is the good life. Now, while all people are affected by ableism, we're not all impacted by ableist practices in the same way. Okay, so, and I want to emphasize that. I mean, I wrote that in 2009, this idea that we're all affected by ableism, but we're not all impacted by ableist practices in the same way. Okay, now I've said that twice because a lot of the discussion and conversation around ableism actually forgets that we're all impacted. Every person is enrolled from the moment of birth. I very rarely make grand statements, but every person from the moment of birth is enrolled into a system of ableism. Now, I'm not sure what happens in India in terms of the kind of medical practices at birth, but I can tell you now that in the West, we have what is known as the APGAR, APGAR, APGAR score. And that test is administered within 5 minutes of birth. Okay, within 5 minutes, and the young newborn baby is then ranked according to and gets a score according to particular markers of health. Okay, so this kind of ranking stuff happens. So due to our positioning, some people may in fact benefit. They can become entitled due to institutional ableism in different settings. But the important bit, and if I get to it at the end of the paper, I will point out this whole issue of entitlement and how some people benefit from ableism. It is very fragile. In fact, I would argue that in the era that we're living in now, it is particularly fragile. I've written in the paper that it's always tentative and provisional. What do I mean by here? I mean that your entitlements, if you are a person who has entitlements, you might have them one day and then your entitlements are gone the next, as I've said. So there's a real fragility about these because we are living in an era that there are changing ideas about what it is to be normal, right? What is the perfect kind of human being? All this stuff is shifting with the rise of cosmetic surgery, cosmetic neurology, and other kinds of technologies. Okay, so we'll get to the definition. I'm not sure, Shilpaa, you'll have to give me a time warning at some stage, if you could, because
yeah, don't worry.
Great.
I think you have about 35 minutes.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I was thinking I didn't have enough to say here, but one of the things is when you're delivering papers, you're in a time-free zone in some ways. So this presentation, and as I said, it's a little bit garbled, but I will get through it, is what I'm really interested in discussing and talking about is the tendency to claim that in terms of disabled people, discrimination is the central problem, right? So it's what I call a discrimination paradigm, okay? And most legal systems use a discrimination paradigm. You think about human rights law, same thing, right? This idea that minority groups, and in our case disabled people, but other people as well, you know, and like you can think about the experience of caste discrimination in India, that it's the discrimination that's the problem, and you know, and there's a choice, and in this system, for example, that there's a preference towards able-bodied people. Now, able-bodied people, it could be how we understand that in disability studies, right? But we could also understand able-bodiedness, for example, in terms of high caste. Okay, it depends on what the criteria is. Okay, we can talk about white people taking on the role of able-bodiedness because the white body, the white mind, whatever that is, are privileged and seen as normative. Okay, but one of the problems then about this this kind of approach for discrimination, and let me be clear on this. I think you know, as someone who comes from a law background, I think I believe in anti-discrimination law, but I believe it is one tool among many. It shouldn't be the sole way of thinking about marginality, oppression, and subordination. Why? Well, one of the problems then is this division between able-bodied and disabled is a fiction. These are fictional definitions, right? And we can see them almost becoming naturalized, you know. And what do I mean by that? Well, you know, we've got we've in disability studies, we focus on the category of disabled, right? And how that's changed over time. Some people are in, some people are out. I mean, one example would be, for example, people with leprosy. Are they disabled or are they sick? What are they? You know, so you know, often that is to do with cultural values. It's also to do with governments, because particularly with the rise of the welfare state, definitions of who is disabled and who isn't are important in terms of accessing legal remedies, but also, you know, state benefits or whatever. But what we haven't done, and this is where studies in ableism can really open up space here, is, you know, you see this being thrown around, this idea of the able-bodied, right? As if it is self-evident, as if being able-bodied is an established fact. Okay, and this is something I know, if you've got some graduate students here today, is the importance in my work is to emphasize the difference between theorizing about something and the actual fact of the existence of something. Now, this is a really complex area which I'm not going to get into, but there is almost this idea, if we keep talking about the able-bodied as a fact, it almost reinforces the status of able-bodiedness, makes it unproblematic. Like, we all know what able-bodiedness is, eh? You know, and not realizing, just as disability and caste have a history, having different interpretations, have different responses, therefore able-bodiedness also has that history. The other thing that I've put in, I think I put it in the abstract, but I haven't spoken about it much in the paper, is that so what we've got is this trend then between this opposition between abled and disabled, right? Forget all the other categories at the moment. And not only are they in opposition, they are in conflict, right? It's a hostile relation. And I've also caused call this idea of what's the word, of seeing able-bodiedness as a pariah. I've called it a form of ability moralism. Okay, because it goes round and round and round about, you know, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. Okay, so one of the things then, as I said, I'm going to go through very, very quickly the concept of ableism. So you've got there, I'm just skipping through my paper here because I've spent a bit more time on this than I had planned to. Okay, so what we've got here, and again, I'm assuming there's some graduate students there or people doing PhDs. Be careful about what you write. So this is a definition that I wrote in an article in 2001, and actually it was a footnote. It wasn't even the main part of the text. Okay, the article was looking at the representations of disabled people in courtrooms, okay, in the legal system, and I put this footnote in, and this. And thank goodness it was watertight and somewhat robust, because I've been stuck with this definition since 2001. I have revised it. I revised the definition in 2017, but not to replace this, just more to supplement it. So let's have a look at what I've put here. So I've said ableism is a network of beliefs, okay, with the important bit about network, processes and practices. So beliefs, processes and practices that produces a particular kind of self and body, the corporeal standard. So this idealized self and an idealized body that is projected as the perfect, species typical, and I'll explain that in a minute, and therefore essential and fully human. So I'll just stop there for a moment. So there's this, there is this idea, and this is where we see also the intersection between science and politics and epistemology, this idea that we can pull out and say, there is a species typical human. This is what humans are and this is what they aren't, right? And we know that this idea of species typical functioning often is still based on the human male and the Western male. Anthropologists have shown us that in different cultures, because people use their bodies differently and use their minds and their imaginations in different ways, that in effect shapes and fashions the body and mind. So this idea of this kind of universal species typical is quite problematic. The second part is, and I've said disability, and I've added here, or any other negative difference. So something that's negative or disposable is cast off as a diminished state of being human. Okay, so really it's a fairly simple and straightforward definition that in order to produce disability or other negative attributions, what I call other disposable people, people who are not fully human, and in fact some people might even say they're non-human, depending on the group. You need this concept of abledness. I think the important thing in this definition, before I move on too much, is that it's not about a group of people. This is not a grand theory that posits that there is an identifiable enemy, you know, an oppressing class that does things, you know. It talks about it, the processes of ableism as a network of beliefs. Sometimes those beliefs come together, sometimes they don't. Sometimes there's different players. If you're familiar with actor network theory, you would understand how that works. And it's through processes and practices and knowledge systems that create this corporeal standard, which, by the way, is not fixed. Okay, that's everything is moving, which makes it even more elusive and hard to grapple with. I often use an example with my students when they're starting to fall asleep, because it's all very theoretical. I use the example of the criteria for entrance into the Miss Universe competition, beauty competition in the 1960s, that the criteria that was used in the 1960s, if you looked at the criteria now for entry, most of those women would have been, what's the word? It's early in the morning, would have been disqualified. That's a nice word. Disqualified. They would have been seen to be too fat and not have the right body shape. So this idea then of the corporeal standard changes through history, and the corporeal standard, as I'll show in the slides, also changes across cultures. Okay. Let me move on here. I've just talked about dividing practices. So one of the things that studies in ableism is it looks at different dividing practices that create different categories that we live by, that result in dehumanization. Whoa, okay. Now, the best ideas that you get are in the bathroom, folks. There's no mystery about this. In 2017, I was having a reflective moment and kind of thinking about, look, you know, one of the things that I've really argued is if you're going to develop a theory around ableism, and particularly, you know, a sub-genre studies in ableism, it needs to be able to cross multiple social worlds. It needs to be able to be responsive to different forms of governance, different cultural approaches, different historical and social arrangements, right? There's nothing worse, and again, you're in India, would experience this, where a lot of the theoretical work or the social theory that comes from the West is often just uncritically imposed upon the global South. You know, what Alataz, the Malaysian sociologist, calls the captive mind, that we just kind of receive this knowledge and say, well, I guess if it's come from the West, they know what they're doing. I mean, obviously it's not as simple as that today, because we're now seeing the development of critical approaches and the development of Indigenous theorising as well. I'll put a reference in my paper. I've just actually picked up a really great book on India and social theory. But one of the things I despite the fact that, you know, I would argue ableism is universal, I don't mean it in the way, as I said, it's the same everywhere. Ableism has changed throughout history. One of the things in my previous work is I actually study the idea of being abled, in the West at least, from the 13th century, and looked at how this notion has changed over time. So it's very much historical, and as I will show later, also there are some cultural differences, but we need to do more research around those, right? But so as I was in the bathroom pondering, well, what are the core attributes of this system? Is it possible to come up with core attributes, core elements? I came up with 5, and, you know, for what I call 5 prongs or 5 elements for looking at how ableism works. Okay, so then it's going from this abstract theory to that second stage about, well, how can we visualize ableism? How can we see the practices, right? And on that basis, because at the end of the day, I'm a political, you know, disability activist, is to look at, well, how can we intervene in these elements, right? So I've come up with these 5. 1, 2, 3. For some reason I've got 4 there. There's 1 missing. Oh, it's negation. Okay, that's really bad, isn't it? But I have dyscalculia. Okay, so okay, so I'll go through these anyway. So the first prong is what we call differentiation. So it's about it's about kind of defining boundaries and borders, saying this one's like this. This is what this group, these are the core qualities, attributes that they have in common, and another group has different kind of attributes. Productivity, for example, I've just put some examples here of we can sometimes more and more in this kind of competitive economic space, there is differentiation on the basis of productivity, what it means to be productive and a scale. There's differentiation on the basis of encumbrance. Now, what does that mean? We know what it means, but not such a fancy term necessarily. This idea of what are you burdened by? Are you burdened by having to look after your aging parents? Are you burdened by having to look after children? I'm deliberately using this language, by the way. Are you burdened by the fact that you're married or have a partner? And that comes, particularly this notion of encumbrance comes from workplace relations, where increasingly there is demand on workers to be available 24/7 and be mobile. Notions of citizenship, who is a citizen and who isn't, and I know you've had some interesting debates of late in India around this. Who's capable, who's making a contribution to society. I think we've also got this, so the second one is ranking. I don't really need to spend much time on this, except you know what ranking actually is, and we do it in different ways. You know, we do it through socioeconomic issues, class, caste, table of names. Now that one might not strike you as a form of ranking, but each body part is given a value. I can remember, again, to get my students to wake up in class with all this stuff, but just to say to them, according to the Canadian Medical Association, if you lose a penis, that you'll be awarded more money than the loss of a vagina. So you can go figure on that one. So you've got a whole body's mapped and ranked. There's negation, is this idea then about what we're not. So to make clear demarcations, in other words, I'm not disabled, or I'm not like those Jewish people, or I'm not a Muslim. So this kind of separation, defensive othering, and even if a person, for example, a disabled person has an obvious disability and identifies as a disabled person, that this negation may happen still by them saying, well, I'm not like those other disabled people, right? So this is kind of defensive othering. And I've also mentioned here notification, that there are certain custodians, for want of a better word, that can document your identity, and that's disability in terms of race, but it might be in terms of like caste status or citizenship or race status, that there are bodies that that certify those things. Okay, so I want to move through really quickly and then talk about some of the problems here. So I did this slide originally for a training program with the Wellcome Trust, and it was Western ableist ideals, right? So and what I've done in the next two slides is have a stab at some other things as well. So this idea of like body image, what does it mean? The picture of our bodies, which we form in our minds. In other words, what we think of ourselves. That is to say, the way in which our body appears to ourselves. So what are the kind of things that we aim for? How do we see ourselves? And I've just put up this chart, which I'll just very quickly go through. I decided to divide it between minds and bodies. I'm not sure if I want to do that, because actually I'm not, by doing that, I'm not presupposing a Cartesian separation between mind and body. But anyway, in the ideal, so this is about what we're aiming for. So with a mind that it's ordered, clear, logical, and you've got your stress under control, rational and even tempered, so that humans are, the idea is that we should be using reason over emotion. And remember, in the history of Western ideals, I mean, women were excluded from social life because women were seen to be incapable of reason and ruled by emotion, right? The hysterical womb comes to mind. This whole thing about being self-moderating, controlling your inhibitions. You follow codes of civility. manners and speech, and that you can adapt. And in fact, that last one, adapt quickly, a self-responsible, I think that has become more dominant in the last 15 or so years. Continuous learning, continuous change. The bodies I've just put here again really quickly. And look, I mean, you know, I could have added to this list, and when I delivered this, people said, "Oh, you didn't put this, you didn't put that." It's just to give you an idea, you know. We do have gendered bodies. I mean, average height, weight, how women, the hourglass figure, you know, how men and women are meant to look different from each other. We still have this idea, the youthful, fit and vigorous body in the West. Absolutely, in the West, the fountain of youth. You know, and almost a lack of respect for our elders. Long living. I'm just going to go on to the next slide then. I'm going through everyone. What I did is I had and I've written other papers if you want to have a look at this. In one of my previous papers, a bit of a brave thing from my perspective, but well researched nonetheless, is I did look at the issue of caste and Velasari and Patra. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing them that correctly, that book. They have quite an interesting theoretical approach to the understanding of caste, and they talk about the caste system as being the ultimate system of human scaling and dehumanization. But what are the features that mark the body under this caste system? Now, obviously, we could keep adding more to this, but I've just pulled out some of these things. So the sense that there are visual determinants of the body and how we perceive those determinants. So here again, we're talking about particular markers, right, that put people into categories and scale categories that are ranked. And even though the caste system has changed, and you know there are different approaches, regional approaches, it is still linked to this idea of visual appearances, but also habits and practices, right? So I mean, obviously the caste system, particularly in rural areas, even the geographical arrangement of the community and the siting of houses and the siting of common resources and exclusionary zones as well. But and the perceptions from others, but it's also one's own perception. So the idea of you being cloaked in your caste identity, just as in the same way of being cloaked in a disability identity. And of course, those bodily appearances and functions are given meaning. I put a couple of other things. This is a newer one, and I should really write about this, you know, is just generally the South Asian ideals that support a system of ableism. So they and we have this in Sri Lanka as well, this concept of Lajabaya, this kind of fear, shame dynamic, this kind of deference, this idea of respectable and unrespectable behavior. I've also put down again, and we need work on this, folks, both from a Hindu and a Buddhist perspective, and maybe even from a Jain perspective, is this idea of what I call karmic individualism. You know, it's about really about we've got this kind of, as I said at the bottom, both within Indian philosophy and in the various schools, there is this emphasis of that, you know, I am my brother, I am my sister, so this kind of common humanity. But then we've got this kind of contradiction and almost paradox, this idea that where we are each individually responsible for our own karmic ripening, and therefore people outside our own selves do not have to respond to the consequences of an individual's karmic ripening. And that raises some really interesting issues around community responsibility to deal with people who are seen as disposable or seen as stigmatized. I've put colorism in here as well. And the very fact, again, we've got this ranking according to color, and even the language that we use in that respect. Okay, how are we going, Shilpaa?
You can take another 5 to 8 minutes.
8 minutes, that's very precise. Okay, So I've just, again, I'm not even going to spend time on this slide because it's in the paper, but as I said to you, we know lots and lots about what goes on in the West. What we need is for Global South researchers to start talking about researching their own context, right? So again, I've been doing recently some work around Confucianism as a philosophical system in China, but there's other countries as well. And it's this idea of what's known as the valuable quality person is the translation in English, quality, disposition and ability. And as you can see there, and I'm not going to read them out, you are seeing the emergence of this ranking, right? So this ability-based ranking, which is changeable. I mean, people aren't fixed in these categories, but nonetheless gives some people entitlements and not. Okay. I'm going to skip over this. We're all affected by ableism. Let me go on for my last 7 minutes. Right. What I've got up here is 3 quotes. I'm not even going to look at my paper. I'll just talk to this. This is what I mean. So increasingly, if people define what ableism is, this is what's being spouted out, okay? And I have some real issues with this. Ableism privileges a non-disabled perspective and promotes the inferior and unequal treatment of disabled people, right? I don't know what a non-disabled perspective is. You know, this is grouping massive clusters of people. We need to unpack that more. You know, it's otherwise it becomes vacuous, right? And extremely problematic. Here's another one from a charity. Ableism is discrimination or prejudice in favour of non-disabled people, right? So again, we need to kind of look at what this idea of favouritism, right? And again, this is another one. However, as disabled, chronically ill and neurodiverse academics, it was for an academic conference, no. Ableism is discrimination in favour, here again, in favour of able-bodied people. So I think this is extremely problematic, right? One reason, as I said to you, is able-bodiedness is fluid. Able-bodiedness is tentative. Not all able-bodied people, if we can even agree what that is, are similarly situated. There are people with a whole range of other marginal status. I think the other problem about this analysis is, and it's an irony with these definitions, is these definitions almost reinforce the very thing that people want to dispute. It's reinforcing the idea that there is this idea of able-bodiedness. I'm hoping I'm getting that really clear here. And you're either it's a thing. You're either it or you're not. So it actually pits disabled people against able-bodied people. And at least you think I'm exaggerating, go on Twitter, because often you'll actually see quite hostile comments. Those abled, in fact, that's another one that's been used now often. The ables, and it's not a term of pride. It's a term of abuse. What I've argued, in fact, that this is still built on what I call a conflict model of relations, which is extremely problematic. Where does it come from? I think it comes from, certainly in the UK, is this idea that merges out of the social model, right, which is based on some quasi-Marxist system anyway, that there is an oppressor and the oppressed, right, who are always caught up in conflictual relations, okay, and it goes round and round and round and round. As I said to you, also from the United States perspective, there is this system of classifying people into, I remember the word now, suspect classes. Isn't that terrible, that language? Suspect classes. So there's certain minority groups, and then the rest of the people. And again, there's this conflictual model. I think it's more useful, and in the paper, I'm wrapping it up here, Shilpaa, in a minute. In the paper, I have spent some time on talking about the rise of new eugenics and what's happened in terms of COVID, and as well as the fact that actually with the rise of what we call cognitive ranking, that is by giving special powers and privileges to people who are seen as more cognitively able in society, that we are starting to see that kind of safety net of able-bodiedness under threat. More and more so-called able-bodied people are going to be cast out into the realm of disposable people. And that's where studies in ableism can break down these barriers and critique the different ways that ableness is understood within different societies. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Campbell. That was really striking, if I can use any adjective at all, because I think what you ended with, this idea of cognitive ranking, is something that strikes at the basis of all critical thinking about caste. And of course, we designate it as merit, right? And so it would be very useful to think through merit as a form of ableism, right? The way in which...
No, absolutely. And the thing is, I mean, it's about, when we go into our research, is to suspend our judgment and look at different things, including contradictions, right? So this idea between meritocracy and cognitive ranking, absolutely, we need to have a look at that and how that works. And interestingly, there's a whole lot of new research flourishing in this area, which I'm really excited about, but also to look at hierarchy. Now, of course, India was the case study for Louis de Mont's hierarchicus, Homo hierarchicus. And a lot of people are going back, he got a lot of criticism, de Mont, and because of his kind of, rendering of the Indian anthropology. But what's happening now is actually people, after many, many decades, people are going back and saying, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's look at his key attributes around hierarchies. The reason why I'm saying that there's paradoxes here, because you've talked about the hierarchies of caste and merit, and there are other systems in the world as well, but also to look at, and this is actually summarized, by the way, in a book by Daniel Bell called Just Hierarchy, ? So is it possible, is hierarchy all bad, given, and what is the basis for equality? Because actually, if we're talking about interrelationships, hierarchy, in fact, if it's done ethically, may in fact work for people who need support. Big question mark there. So nobody say that I'm supporting that. What it is about thinking through these issues. Is it possible to rescue hierarchy from its kind of demonic, unequal?
So thank you so much for your lecture. I'm going to open it up for questions or comments from the audience. Everyone's welcome to type their questions in the chat box, or if you wish to raise your hand and speak, then that's fine as well.
Yeah, there's no such thing as a stupid question. If there's something that I've said that you've not understood, or you want some further clarity, I'm happy to do that.
Okay, so shall I read out the question in the chat box? Okay. Eva says, fascinating talk. Rebecca Tolstig, in her book Sitting Pretty, has a long discussion about the deficiencies of the Oxford Dictionary definition of ableism, which is discrimination in favor of able-bodied people, and offers instead the following. Ableism is the process of favoring, fetishizing, and building the world around a mostly imagined, idealized body, while discriminating against those bodies perceived to move, see, hear, process, operate, look, or need differently from that vision. Could you comment on this? Do you see this as an improvement?
Well, firstly, I need to look at it carefully and think about it. So that's the thing about never rush with these things. But I do like the fact that she's put the word fetishization in, because I think it is, because one of the things in my training course that I did for the Wellcome Trust is I said to them, ask the students, and they're mainly curators of museums and things, about if we know that ableness is a fiction, why do we still sign up to it, you know? And like, for example, if we know that there's, particularly like for women, I can only speak about women because I'm a woman, but you know, like this idea about the beauty myth. I mean, most women know about the kind of bull dust around kind of, you know, what it means to be beautiful, et cetera, and how they measure up. But instead of saying, you know, that's bull crap and I'm not having anything to do with it, people will still try and emulate that, even though it's a standard they can never reach. So I think I'm not familiar with her work. That's good. At least somebody's doing something on this. But this issue about why we enroll in these things, and you know, yeah, and how they change cultural practices. And the problem now also is it's more complex. This is why ableism works well here, is to look at what are the investments in this. So for example, marketing, advertising, money. And one of the things in my studies that I look at, and I believe there's a book coming out on this called Hairless, is I look at the very famous marketing campaign in 1915 by Gillette Razor Company, which was the first time of getting women to shave their armpits and their legs. And I always say it's the most successful marketing campaign in history, because it actually changed cultural practices around the globe.
Yeah. There's a comment from Shogata that says that this was a really enlightening talk, and there's a request for your PowerPoint slides. I'd also like to reiterate that request, Fiona, because there are a few members in the audience who would have preferred everything on the slide to be read out. And I think there was that Confucianism slide where we didn't really hear everything.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I went over it quickly. I'm happy to pass on the PowerPoints, but as I said to you, I go one better on that. I'm happy to distribute the fully written paper, because the thing about these new ideas is they're not, this is not easy, right? If you're thinking about new ideas, you have to reflect upon it and then make the connections. And as I said to you, on the paper I'll send you, I'll also give you a link to my Academia EDU site, and there's a couple of other draft papers. These folks are working papers, they're not fixed, and some academics don't like doing working papers because they're worried about people stealing their work. But I think for me, I'm more interested in us having a conversation.
Yes, you've always been generous with that. You know, even when I wrote to you and said, can I use an idea for one of my class slides? You said I could go ahead.
Yeah. Can I say to you particularly, and I did this in an article that was recently published in the Indian Journal of Critical Disability Studies, the first issue, but is what I really am keen on doing it, and I can't do it, and it's not appropriate anyway, is for us, given that many non-Western societies have different degrees of religiosity, is to kind of really engage with the key thinkers and like in particularly Indian philosophy. Also, then there's the divide between philosophy, theory, and ideas and practice. How does this get distilled down to the village level? We urgently need that, but we also, not just as a criticism, but as a counterforce to Western domination. And same with China at the moment. We're doing work in that area. So we need more research at that theoretical level.
Yes, I agree. Other questions or comments? Would somebody like to speak out their question? You we could.
Shilpaa, I like to
Yeah,
ask, but
Hemachandran, go
I
ahead.
didn't. Sorry, I didn't know how to raise my hand.
That's fine. Go ahead.
In the age of Zoom, it's hard for me to raise my hand without knowing the keyboard command.
Actually, I
Right.
can't see it either, actually, come to think of it.
Thank you, Professor Campbell. I was taking in every word you were saying, so much. Yeah, striking at the heart of the matter. Thank you so much. But I want to ask about this. That is authenticity making. I am blind. So if I have to speak with a stamp of authenticity, I want, with my credentials as a blind person, with my experiences as a blind person, I am saying this, I am saying that. So in some sense, it seems to me after listening to you, the heart of authenticity making also involve crude forms of ableism, which can be hidden at the bottom. But
Yes.
I may not say that, I may not come across that way, but my authenticity making exercises, uh, views, comments, uh, discourses that I peruse
Yep.
and sediment them
Mm-hmm.
in the heart of authenticity making
Mm-hmm.
can involve ableism.
Yep.
So how do we handle that? That's my
Okay. This is a great question, and I think you should write a paper on it for the start. One of the things, a couple of things, and there's some tension here with this. There's a theorist by the name of Joan Scott who says, and I'm paraphrasing here, no experience is pre-theoretical. Now, what does she mean by that? She means that even the language, the metaphors, the nuances that we use to talk about our experience is culturally produced, right? So, what do I mean by that? Like, if somebody talks about their experience as a sexual abuse survivor, or indeed as a serial killer, there is a narrative that's already there, to how people explain their own behaviors, their own reactions. And it's very difficult to step outside of that. And you might want to think of the narratives that that disabled people draw on themselves as a form of self-explanation. Why I think you should write a paper on it is, this is where the tension, we keep talking about the lived experience of disability, right? That's often used now. Let's not look at the professionals. We need to valorize the lived experience of disabled people. Now, as a disabled person, I think that's great. We get ignored. But is it authentic? Is it pure? Is it uncontaminated? Absolutely not. As I said at the start, we are all inaugurated into an ableist world. How we process our sense of disability, our relationship with disability, a sense of self, will be different, and it is by itself contaminated. It's not possible to escape out of that system. And there are exceptions to the rule. For example, you hear of like profoundly deaf people being raised by profoundly deaf parents, in a profoundly deaf community and not associated with general society. So I think so firstly, I think, lived experience is important, but the authenticity assumes there's something pure behind that experience. And I would say, following Joan Scott, that, the language we use to describe ourselves is culture bound. The second point I want to make about the issue of authenticity of lived experience is, disabled people are excluded from education, often excluded. But you know, and there is also a deprivation of experience in the world. So actually, you know, whilst it politically might sound great to say we are the experts of our own lives, actually often we're not. Many disabled people know nothing about their impairments. They know nothing about the options that they could have and what the alternatives are because of their oppression, because of their social exclusion. So I think we just need to tread carefully about that. And I would, you know, I really would suggest you write a paper on it, but also just to look at how this authenticity narrative is used. It's big, you know, it gets picked up as a sense of kind of like a blank slate idea of human beings, a sense of purism, and I think we need to look at that. By the way, I'm happy to, if you do want to do a paper, I'm happy to comment on any drafts if you're feeling like you're a fish out of water, because this idea of nothing about us without us, and that, you know, my experience, I'm in charge of my destiny, is so dominant in civil rights movements. We have to be very careful about this. I think it's also, we need to have allies.
Yes. Yeah, you have a lot of compliments in the chat box, but no big question yet. But yeah, if I may just use my privilege as chair.
Why not?
Yeah, I think that it was really useful to hear that there's a way of moving forward by thinking in terms of affinity, by thinking in terms of experiences that may be similar. And I know that elsewhere you've written about humiliation, because humiliation, again, is that experience that is common to different marginalized groups, or the existence of, I mean, the lived realities or social realities of a lot of groups and so on. So yeah, while you're talking about that, you were also saying it would be important to draw on cultural knowledges or do culturally located research. Now, one of the responses that one often gets while talking about this culturally located or situated research is that, does that really exist? Are things really so culturally demarcated? You know, are these separate realms? Aren't they all kind of flattened by a globalizing world and so on? So how do you respond to that question in your own work or in your thinking?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So firstly, can I say that my ideas around humiliation are actually drawn from Indian studies, but particularly the edited collection. Well, there's a book called Humiliation by Gopal. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And because actually, and I say this in a positive way, I think India as a vast country is the place to go and study humiliation and the insights, what we can learn from this. You know, I'm not saying that humiliation doesn't happen in the West, but it's a different kind, or is it? Now, your question about culture, I mean, it's you know, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? About the kind of the local versus a global kind of aspect to this. I think, you know, more and more the quality and rigor of research is important. For me, cultural studies is not only useful in documenting and saying, hey, we do things in a different way, or we do things, you know, in a similar way to whatever that is. It allows us as a global community and as a local community to expand our imaginations. You know, it's interesting, but in terms of colonial work, is that often people in the global South know more about other countries than their own, you know what I mean? Like in their own history. And I'm not just talking about like South Asia. Even as somebody who lived in Australia, most young people know about American history, like all the ins and outs, and they keep talking about First Amendment rights, and I'm thinking, that doesn't apply in our country, but they don't know about their own history, right? So I'm using that as and that's a kind of like a white-based country. So I think actually it's really important to know about the cultural trajectories of ableism, and I think particularly given some of the challenges that are happening within India itself about you know, the kind of unitary relationships and the differences between different areas of India, and how India itself tackles inequalities. I think that we need that research. The other thing is that done carefully, it can provide other people in the world with other possibilities. And I guess this idea of imagination, you know, imagination, I dream a dream, has been really important for marginalized people to think of, you know, another way out. In terms of globalization, I mean, you know, it's really interesting because, you know, we can do this conference now, and I've done heaps during lockdown, and, you know, you can move materials, but you know, globalization is, as I don't need to tell people here, is inherently unequal. And I mean, I've always argued that America doesn't need to go in and bomb everybody now, although it does. It can colonize people through information and conceptual domains, and using Zoom, for example. So I think actually we need to, I think there will always be some asymmetry between knowledge production and academia, but injecting new ideas. So for example, I teach my students the Jain concept of the four-cornered argument. Now, something that might go in and out one ear for some of you there, but the fact that, you know, in the West it's either right or wrong, and you're arguing. And so I will say to my students that, you know, there are other approaches such as the Jain four-point argument, and you know, it's about enlarging our imagination. But if we don't know about our own countries or our own regions, and not also a story of doom, to talk about the qualities, right? Because you see, you've got me onto something, Shilpaa. I will shut up in a minute. But one thing that really annoys me, and India and Sri Lanka get this, so Hinduism and Buddhism in this respect, is I get sick to death of saying the reason why people in India and people in Sri Lanka have bad attitudes towards disabled people is because of karma. You know, and you know, it's even in the government documents. That's the worst bit. And what a load of BS. So, you know, I'll keep polite here. Actually, show me the studies. Show me the in-depth studies of disability and karma. Well, guess what? They're not there. So you know, it's so this stuff of what do you call it? Self-persecution, about to say, oh, we are culturally backward. You know, we're not like the West. Yes, we do treat disabled people because we've got this backward concept of karma. That's why we need the research. But the research also hopefully will also enhance and promote conversations within communities.
Yeah, thank you. There's a kind of self-orientalizing that we do. You know,
well, as I said, yeah, I mean, when governments are spouting out the same crap, you know, and I've seen this in Sri Lankan policy, so I'll just stick to Sri Lanka on this. And I think, you know, it's totally unfounded. And not only is it just kind of, it's denigrating a whole religious tradition. So then the opposite of that, say, well, okay, maybe the Judeo-Christian tradition is more civilized. So, you know, you're buying into a whole lot of stuff that's extremely problematic.
Yeah. Thank you. Krishna has a question in the chat box. He says it was an excellent talk that he thoroughly enjoyed, but would like to know what made you shift into theorizing ableism when you started out in disability studies earlier?
Good question. You know, Bell Hooks, who's a famous African-American woman theorist, she said, and I can kind of paraphrase it, she said, in theory, I found healing. Theory helped me make sense of my lived experience. So, and I've always used that quote because, you know, depending on what kind of theoretical frameworks we develop and use, it will produce different questions. We will ask, different questions. I think it's accidental. Maybe the gods were looking above and it was accidental. I think when I was looking at the representations of disabled people in the courtroom, the two representations were the disabled person as a sufferer or the disabled person as an overcomer of their disability. So it probably got me onto that. The other thing was, and this is why you need to dig deep, I was reading a lot of work around constructions of bodies. I've been studying Buddhism for a long time. And Indian philosophy. So actually, I was finding the disability studies, Shilpaa will hate this. I was finding the disability studies stuff really boring and going round in circles, and mainly dealing with kind of, you know, white Western preoccupations that had nothing to do with the daily lives of the majority world of disabled people. So it's about digging deep and reaching out, and I'd really encourage you to do that. But, you know, sometimes things happen for a reason.
Thank you so much, Fiona. No, and I wouldn't thank you for that at all, which is why we reached out to you to come and talk to us about this, you know, very exciting work that you're taking, that you're doing, and taking disability studies away, you know, and kind of enlivening it up a bit. Reshma has a point here. It's also interesting to note that the dominating view of karma doesn't provoke one to change one's attitudes and behavior towards disability and persons with disability, considering the future will be a retribution of one's acts in that sense.
Oh yeah, look, there's some really interesting, I mean, I don't know as much to do with Hindu practices in terms of karma. I can say within Buddhist practices, no, it doesn't. And then it becomes this superstitious system that I don't know whether, Shilpaa, you were talking about before in terms of merit, but this kind of thing that you help people really just to help yourself. So it comes back to what's the motivation, you know what I mean? Like it's extremely problematic, and you actually need helpless people around you for you to be to be elevated. But the other thing about it is, as I said to you, that's why more work needs to be done on it. We talk about karmic ripening. Karma is actually about change and growth. So actually, it's not a fatalistic view. It's really about, well, actually, how can we remedy things and take control? My concern is, and I will shut up about this, I mean, is certainly on Buddhism, I've heard the most appalling things about disability that have come out of monks' mouths. You know, again, this kind of the word retribution. I mean, that's, I don't know how that goes down in India, but certainly in the English that I use, the word retribution's pretty full on. This idea that you are disabled because, and this is a form of retribution about basically about you doing something evil.
Yeah,
that's really bad. That's a real victim blaming.
Oh yeah, and there's a lot of it in India as well. Yeah, I don't see other questions in the chat box. Is there anyone who'd like to speak their question? We have a minute or two.
Lucky last. You can ask me anything.
How early in the morning is it for you?
Oh, it's not too bad. It's 10:30 now, so it's it's you know, as I said, can I mean, I certainly with I would encourage you to support the Indian Journal of Critical Disability Studies. But you know, I must say I was very nervous about writing some things on caste, and it's complex. It's very complex. But you know, the more people kind of look at some of the cultural issues, you know, whether it be, for example, around gender roles and parenting. I mean, I recently put out a piece on in the Sri Lankan context, because nothing's been written about it, is on the mothers as caregivers and the absent father. So this kind of stuff we need to hear. You know, we need to hear more about this. You know, how does gender affect the lifespan of disabled people? Do disabled women get the same kind of opportunities as disabled men?
Yeah, we have a few scholars working on that area, particularly Nandini Ghosh and Shubhangi Vaidya, Anita Ghai, of course.
Of course.
Yeah, and Nilika as well. And that's the area of scholarship that's also growing. There are a lot of PhD students wanting to work on gender and disability, from
and it'd be good if they use studies in ableism as a conceptual framework. So just to give you one example, which probably could apply to India, possibly, I've got a student who's just started with me who's looking at disabled parents having their children taken away from them because they're seen as, basically ontologically unfit parents before you even look at them. And so that student's going to be looking at ableism and family law. So it's really interesting. I don't know what backgrounds people come from, but it would be good to look at the court cases. There's kind of ideas about disability that have appeared in court cases, or
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
I think I'm going to wind up this session. Thanks a lot. Thanks immensely for sharing all these ideas with us, and also for being so graceful with letting us know where your papers are and what we can draw on. But I think one of the most useful things for me is that you're drawing on a multiplicity of epistemic frames to think about ableism, and it's not just restricted to one notion of behaviorism. So I think that's been an important learning for me. Thank you, Fiona, and thank you everyone.
Thank you very much.
Who's been present here, and thank you to Garima, who's been interpreting.
Yes, so I hope it wasn't too fast.
I think Garima says that you were okay, not too fast. Okay, yeah, all right. On that note, I'll just remind you all that the next session begins at 4:30, and those are the technical papers, the technical sessions for the day. See you, Fiona, and take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.